Hi, and welcome to a new episode of Building Resilience. This is our 10th conversation in the series, so we decided to make it a special one. We are reflecting together on the key learnings from the first 9 episodes and the unknown phases of resilience that still require in depth studying. We talk about purpose, experimentation, complexity, creating slack, and building robustness, about adaptability and meta learning. My guests are Phanish Puranam, Professor of Strategy and Organizational Design at INSEAD, Narayanan, Professor of Management and Organization at NUS, and Ekin Ilseven, PhD student in Strategy at INSEAD. If you did not have a chance to watch the first 9 episodes, this is a great summary of the conversation so far. I do invite you to listen until the end so you can also find out what's next on the series. Through this podcast, we are bringing resilience research and practice closer to you. If you enjoy the content, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comment section below. Your views and your feedback are very important to the development of the podcast. Enjoy our conversation. Hi Ekin, hi Phanish, hi Jay, and welcome to Building Resilience in Review.
Hello, Julia.
Hello, Julia.
Good to see you.
Good to see all of you, and it's good to have this conversation now after 9 recorded episodes, so this would be the 10th one, a sort of anniversary one. So let me start with a very quick question, and let me know what has been your experience with the series so far.
First of all, I think it was an amazing experience. So much rich perspectives, different views on it, and you could see how should we act now, because the crisis is urgent. But then there's also a whole different view. How do we achieve resilience in the long term, going beyond the crisis? I think one of that. So yeah, I saw that diversity of perspectives in terms of the temporal focus. I thought was very interesting, and it made me question what's the role of time in resilience. So that was one of the interesting points. And the second one is there's the time, and then there's, let's say, space. My background is in physics, so I tend to think that way. And in terms of space, there's individuals, teams, departments, organizations, and then we go on to communities, climate. So many different topics have been discussed so far, and how they fit together. At what level are we supposed to start talking about resilience, and when should we change what we think of resilience? So, for example, Roland talked about absorbing a shock or adapting to it. This is how resilience is achieved. But then, at which level should we look for these signatures? I think those kind of perspectives. So, time and space-wise, I think so many diverse perspectives, and I thought it was very exciting to watch all of the contributions.
Thanks so much, Ekin. Jay?
Okay, thank you so much, Julia, for doing those conversations. And I think one question you asked many of the guests was, what really is the purpose of resilience? It's like, that was kind of interesting to see the variance in answers, and also seeing how different, but still also some connections across. So for me, the key things I learned, I'm as a psychologist, I think of resilience very much as something that's embedded in individuals. And to shift that level of analysis to collectives and to organizations was really informative. That was my first kind of big aha moment. And it's not really a question of the sum adding up, the parts adding up to the whole. It's there is something bigger that comes as resilience at a higher level of analysis that's not really captured in a more individual level of analysis. That's something that came across to me. The one point that I think really for me stood out across many different guests was really this kind of paradox that's inherent in resilience, where there is an instinct to maybe to downscale, to retreat, but you've got to do the opposite, and oftentimes you've got to do both simultaneously. So to me, that came across different guests. And one of the episodes that really struck me quite a lot was actually Ranjay's episode, Ranjay Gulati, on the importance of purpose. I'd really not connected those two dots. Organizations have purpose, and you often think of purpose as a way to engage people. At least that's how most of the micro organizational behavior literature has thought about purpose. But really, as a purpose is some sort of something to hold on to in a crisis that provides the GPS, to use that metaphor, in times of crisis. So that to me also was a very important a piece of learning. And yeah, and there are a bunch of others which we'll get into. And the other thing also, which surprisingly, came from strategy scholars, was the role of self-compassion, the role of the willingness to make mistakes. To me, that's such an important part of resilience, because otherwise resilience can quite often break people. So how they respond to errors and mistakes in times of crisis, and how when you if you want to rebound back from that, you often have to have an internal dialogue of compassion, of forgiveness. So to me, that's something top of mind for me as well from the conversations which came across. So those are the few things for me to begin with, and then we can keep going. Julia, thank you so much.
For sure, we can keep going. I'll add my part and then I'll ask you, Phanish, to conclude. I think the thing that got me thinking the most was Lisa Velikanga's idea of zero trauma transformation. And at that point, I was like, "Wow, is this even possible? I mean, how can we even conceive that this can happen?" And talking about gestures with her and talking about serendipity, I think it added very nicely and rounded up the discussion so far. What I've used very, very much after the series and what I've learned was from Kostas Markides when he's talking about the new normal, and not that the new normal is just one change that we are going through, that there are overlapping changes that we need to somehow manage. And definitely the discussion with Dan Levinthal has been an eye-opener. And he's the one that actually said that, why are you asking this question if there is a purpose to resilience? That's a dumb question. You shouldn't ask this. Well, I said, okay. I was wondering myself if I should ask this question or not, but still I kept asking it just to make sure that am I aligned with someone or not? And it was very nice to see how he's looking at exploration and exploiting and looking at this whole concept of resilience from a systemic perspective, not from one layer to another, but as a whole connected to each other. And not only the individual, the team, the organization, but also nature and communities, climate and everything else. And definitely the one with Rajri and Connie, where we discussed a lot about experimentation. And I think one thing that stood out from that one was towards the end when we discussed about peripheral vision, to really be able to grasp those opportunities. So that connects a bit to serendipity as well. And then, yeah, definitely the whole series has been mind-opening for me.
Thank you, Julia. I enjoyed all the episodes, and I've just been watching some of them again, a second time again. And there were a couple of things that also stood out for me. So I think prior to this particular shock that we're all living through, there was a strand of the literature on resilience which said you could become resilient by becoming farsighted. So it's really about being well prepared to anticipate the future. And that always struck me as being rather over optimistic. And I think that strand of the discussion has now disappeared. So almost none of our speakers made a pitch about becoming resilient by investing in being able to foresee the future. I think there's now kind of a more broad acceptance that resilience is about dealing with unexpected shocks, which by definition cannot be expected, right? So any attempt to try and expect them is kind of futile. And I think that's a pretty important milestone in our journey of understanding this. It's really about having to cope with stuff that you can't foresee. And that's a very common thread that came across from their talks. The other is the importance of the organization as a unit that fosters resilience, both at the unit of the organization level, but also among the individuals within it. And Dan's work, obviously, is because it's quite close to mine, resonates a lot because what he forces us to think about is what's the advantage that an organization can give for collective experimentation that a market or a crowd cannot. Right? In principle, one can have lots of people individually experimenting and trying new stuff to cope with a change. So, what is it that makes those experimentations more powerful if they are conducted within an organization? And he didn't use the word purpose, I think, but his sense of guiding principles are very similar to the notion of purpose in Ranjay's talk, right? The notions of social capital. Again, they don't use that language necessarily in his world, but which is very much in Lisa's world and the world of some of the other speakers. Clearly, social capital, experimentation, these are at the core of why this process of looking for new answers might be more effectively achieved inside an organization as opposed to outside. And kind of the third point is not really directly tied to any one speech, but I was struck by this metaphor that we are all talking about vaccination right now, and the way vaccination works is it gives you kind of this unpleasant experience, and the hope is you build antibodies. And I think COVID-19 is a vaccination for the world, right? In some sense, it is hopefully triggering in the entire world, in the global system, the antibodies that will help us to fight the next crisis. Now, whether it does that or not, I think is a managerial problem that we all have to deal with. But hopefully, we learn something from how we react to this, which will work effectively like a vaccine, so we can cope better with the next shock that's coming. Because for sure, there will be another. It may not be a pandemic; it may be something else, but there will be another. And tying back to the first point, we won't be able to foresee it, right? So it really comes down to do we have the antibodies to cope with the next shock? So I thought that was an interesting thread across these talks.
How did you see organizations react during all this period?
So I can give an answer, and maybe Jay and Ekin can jump in on this. I think several different things are going on, and as you say, they may have different labels. So there is kind of the immediate pressure of what do we do to get back to a semblance of normalcy and continue with business as quickly as possible. There, the focus has really been on working distributedly. So how do we get remote working to happen? So a lot of the immediate org design changes have been around that. There are a second set of issues which are slightly more longer term, which is given the recession that many companies are looking at, how do we cut costs? So there will be some restructuring and reorganization just driven by that very mundane consideration. How do we get rid of costs? Some more kind of enlightened thinking is about the impact on employees' mental health, their well being, and what can organization design and restructuring do to kind of cope with that. But the really long term thinking about how do we change our organizations to become more resilient for the next shock? I don't know if anybody's doing anything about it right now. I hear some desire to do it, but I don't yet see evidence of anything very concretely happening at large scale there. We're still fighting this crisis, basically. I don't know if you guys would agree, but that's my sense.
As Phanish, as you were saying, that this is kind of an inoculation for the future shock. And I was just, as I was listening to something else, like on another podcast, which is saying when you're going through periods of exponential change, you often cannot, you often don't know when one shock has ended and another has begun, because they come in such close sequence, because it's just such rapid changes. So I do think that your metaphor is a nice way to think about it, because we many people have said these zoonotic viruses are here to stay, and people have had conspiracy theories on how many experts had predicted this, but they predicted this in many different forums. But of course, people only cherry pick some and say, hey, they knew this was coming. So I do think that this is really a dress rehearsal, because you look at this and you look at the fatality rates, you look at how quickly the vaccines came about. Um, the real nightmare scenario is something far more draconian than what we are facing today. So really, this could be kind of the dress rehearsal, something quite mild, given what might come, and given the changes we're going to see with other shocks like climate change and all of that, which we know is coming. That very well could be true, and every shock is going to seem like, oh my God, that was nothing. The previous one was nothing. This is so much worse. So that's, I think, how this is going to feel. And as much as I don't like the word new normal, and I think Yulia, you touched upon this as well. I think there's no other good word to capture that. I think it's I don't know if there's a better word to capture the sentiment that there was this pre-pandemic time, and now we are in some sort of post-pandemics. People like to use the word post-pandemic. I even have the domain name postpandemicwork.com, so which I bought in February of 2020, which I kind of think is a bit of a goofball name right now, because I don't think there is going to be a post-pandemic world. There is just the world. So yeah. So just going back to Phanish's thing, it might just be an inoculation for far worse things to come. And I don't mean to be a doomsday sort of person, but I think that's really going to be the case.
Maybe to build on this, first of all, I definitely agree that organizations now prioritize much more the mental health of their employees. It has become a critical issue. Working from home, we're still trying to figure out if working from home is actually increasing productivity or not. Just like we test vaccines, we test them for 3 months, 6 months. Working from home, we need to test also for a year, 2 years, see what it actually does to people. I think we're still learning and going through this pandemic, but the fact that I think organizations, leaders are paying much more attention to its potential impact and that they care about people's well-being, I think that's one thing that came out of this pandemic, and I think that was an interesting contribution of the pandemic to our society, in a sense, like vaccination. One thing, though, I'm a little bit more skeptical about is, there are things that contribute to the resilience of organizations or society, but then, as Phanish said, are we really building resilience for future shocks? What was interesting for me is that we ran away from pandemic, we ran home and to the digital world, and the amount of cyber attacks was incredible in the past year. And I'm thinking of Roland's perspective. He said that autonomous cars, some people see them as means of getting from A to B, and some others see it as an impact on climate, on social interactions, and so on. So I believe learning to think about resilience would have kind of required people to think, okay, we're digitizing now, but what about the cyber attacks? We're digitizing now there are mental effects. We're digitizing now, there are, so many servers are set up. Now, one of our biggest concerns in Bitcoin space is how do we make it environmentally friendly? So digitization did not come only with psychological effects, and I think it's still something that organizations need to reflect on, what kind of an impact it has in multiple dimensions. And that will be,
I really like the metaphor of inoculation and antibodies, Phanish, and maybe we can still go with it. Because I feel that with what we've been going through and what we've been talking about resilience and the way organizations are changing and all the studies that have been done, we can somehow be intentional about building these antibodies. So I'm thinking, what would be some good, prerequisites or good resilience items that organizations should build, because we already know that they're going to help us going forward. So things that we should put in place, and there's no discussion because we know that they're good and they're going to help.
So I would split the answer into two parts, and I think the first part is the easy one, which I can give, and the second we should ask our current world expert on the literature on resilience, which is Ekin. So he can respond to the second part. So I think the first part is easy. You first need enough kind of slack in the system just to survive the shock and live another day to fight. Right? So that buffering capacity is clearly the first thing. And that has a very important implication for strategy and for finance and operations. In our worlds, we tend to optimize everything to the last dollar, right? But optimization today could mean fragility tomorrow. That's the big lesson about resilience that we get. So over optimizing stuff is dangerous. You want to leave enough slack in the system so you can buffer the shock when it comes, because it will, and we won't be able to forecast it. So that's one mechanism.
Slack means what? Slack means financial resources, time resources. What does Slack mean?
It could mean all of those in excess of what you need to operate now. So it could be more money than you strictly need for operations. Currently, much thinking would say we should leverage the company, right? Not rely on our own money. So we shouldn't be hoarding cash. Is like a very basic finance injunction. in most circumstances. But in a world like this, we should, right? We should be taking every extra piece of belay or waste in the supply chain out, right? We should not have redundant suppliers. We should have like a couple of really good suppliers and work with them. Again, that thinking is not accurate in a world in which resilience matters. So that's what I mean by slack. We shouldn't be spending so much money on R&D because R&D is extremely low return. We never know when it will pay off. We should be spending more because that's what will help us fight our way out of the next crisis when it happens. So that's kind of the first level, which is just to make sure we have enough to survive the first effect of the shock. What to do after that is a very complicated problem of adaptation, but our friend Ekin has all the answers.
But yeah,
I think we all wish you had all the answers, because that would be so
in
easy.
general, we go to Phanish for all the answers, but but no, one thing that kind of stood out to me, yes, the buffering definitely is one important component, and again, there's when we look at the literature, there's an extensive amount of articles written about how organizations should adapt once a shock hits the system, and then there are studies of what happens when the shock is actually the source is internal, like a CEO leaving a company, versus when there's a supply shock, there's a demand shock, those kind of things. There has been the ways of adapting to these things that they have been studied. But one thing that stands out to me is, and this is already acknowledged in the literature as well, but is this notion of self-organizing capability, and this relates a lot to experimentation and innovation, and at the same time to purpose. I feel like when we're talking about really unexpected shocks, first of all, as Dan said in his conversation, and Phanish brought up, organizations can offer a space where adaptation and experimentation can take place differently, and that is important. But I feel like all of these are contributing to, or at least determining how an organization self-organizes itself once an unexpected shock happens. I think one important point made by Huggy was that there are the culture as in absorbing the shock, and from sociological perspective, he mentioned Carr's work, and then there are subsequent works which argue that a shock is not a crisis unless it disrupts people's sense making. Is people can make sense of the world, is it really a crisis? And so in that sense, this notion of adaptation and buffers, I think they interrelate in such a way that when we cannot make sense of the world, all we have as an organization is relying on each other, coordinating with each other, figuring out what's happening. And on that front, I think the literature definitely supports the view on experimentation, having a purpose that aligns people's actions. We don't get all over the place. This also speaks a little bit to Rashri and Connie's statement that we all want to change and innovate, but stability is just as important. So in that sense, I think having the knowledge resources or the emotional, or the relational resources, as the literature would put, is really important when we are trying to make sense of this new world and try to adapt to this shock. And buffers are necessary for us to be able to do that.
Jay, and if we look at the individual level, how would this buffering and adaptation look like?
Yeah, so at the individual level, should you hoard on cash is my question. I don't think so. I don't know whether fiat is the way to go. That's a conversation for another time with the folks that believe that fiat is going nowhere. No, but just coming back to the question at the individual level, I do think that the idea of zero trauma, zero trauma transformation, zero trauma transformation is an interesting idea, and I it doesn't hold up at the individual level. Okay, the idea of zero trauma doesn't hold up at the individual level. At least you need minimum shocks. You need small shocks, and that's exactly the idea of a vaccination. The metaphor that Phanish used earlier on, one idea I think, which I think is very interesting to kind of bring into this discussion here from the individual stress literature, is the idea of hormesis. And hormesis is the idea that, like, small stressors that doesn't kill you will make you stronger in the long run. But the key is that it shouldn't kill you, right? And for you not to be killed, you need that buffer. So if you put a 80-year-old person with metabolic conditions into an ice bath, which is one of the ways to trigger hormesis, they would just die because there is no buffer left in them to build any resilience. But if you put like a young man of Ekin's age into the lake, which is freezing cold, he's likely to get stronger because there is buffer. Like, he has resources to bring to the table that actually will make him stronger. So it really holds at the individual level to having the buffer, having the psychological resources to deal with stress. If it doesn't break you, will provide you with resources to adapt. Now, those resources, you may not have them, right? You may not have a set of resources to deal with these shocks, psychological resources. You may have resources in the bank. You may be wealthy, but you may not have the psychological resources, which is why things like mindfulness that I study actually come into effect. And that's the mental health part of the puzzle that organizations have been talking about. So, what doesn't break you will make you stronger. But the problem in the world is that many things will break you unless you have some buffers. So that's, I think, how it plays out at the individual level.
This is nice because this is the known. What is the unknown in resilience? What are the things that we didn't yet study or we don't have a good grasp on? At all levels, individual, organizational, maybe even systemic level.
It's a good question. I think at the individual level, I can say that, like, it seems to me that at least at the individual level, like, you look at the literature on trauma, right? Like, so there's literature that shows that, when people have early childhood trauma, they kind of become resilient. But there is a survivor bias there, right? Like, you don't study all those people that suffered trauma that actually didn't make it. So the unknown question is that there seems to be something about this shock, this trauma, that some people are just able to cope and become resilient and some others don't. Just what is that? What is it that, what are these factors that allow people to bounce back from that shock at an individual level, like, a level of analysis? I know that at an organizational level of analysis, there will be different answers to that question, but we just don't quite know, actually. It just seems to be there are these case studies of people that have trauma that become very resilient, but we just don't quite know very well why that's the case. So that would be something that I would put out there.
I think a abstract way to make the point generalize beyond the individual and all the way up to organizations. It's got to be something we know the shape of, which is it's got to be something that helps systems to learn how to learn. Right? That's what it must be, because this is Chris Ajaris and his work at HBS many years ago. He made this very astute observation that there is learning and there is learning how to learn. And learning how to learn is what might be triggered by these events. Right? So if somebody survives one of these traumatic events, either as an individual or as an organization, you learn something in that process of survival. But you also have this meta learning, which is how to improve the way you learn. So the next time you get hit, you're faster at adapting to that. And I think that's like the organizing principle that connects things across levels of analysis. And we have a speculation about this, but Jay is right. I don't think we have like very concrete evidence or ways of triggering this kind of second order learning to help resilience in particular.
One thing that stood out is, first of all, from these series, the importance of purpose is clear, but establishing purpose, how do we create that purpose that resonates with people? We know there are some ways. We can hire lots of people who already agree with the purpose, let's say. But still, there is this So I think when we consider purpose and time, I think role of time is something that we need to understand better in resilience. So when Phanish says learning to learn, we're talking about, let's say, financial crisis happens, and then there's coronavirus now, and who knows what's the next thing. But then there was Spanish flu, 100 years ago, and we must have learned something there, but we must have also forgotten it because it's been too long ago. So I feel like there is not much attention, or at least there should be more attention paid to the notion of time, because one thing that I was interested in is in social sciences, there is one view that we are purposeful agents, whether an organization, individual, or whatever, but purposeful action. And there was this really interesting book that I read. It's Gödel Escherbach. Sorry, I'm giving spoilers, but there, the how do we define purpose depending on time is very interesting, because if we talk about the lifetime of the universe, what is really our purpose? But at the same time, what is our purpose in this hour differs so much from our purpose about what we want to do when we wake up. Which clothes to put on is a different way of, it's a different purposeful action compared to a week, a month, a year. And I feel like setting up purpose is not so easy in an organization where we're talking about an individual's daily concerns versus monthly or long-term concerns, and then an organization's, they don't live in the same time scales. And how do we manage that? I feel like there has to be a lot more work on that time and purpose, and how do we learn accordingly from all of this. I think that's one interesting.
That's, and I just want to kind of build on what Ekin you said. That's so spot on. And as an academic, I'm so happy that I don't have to actually do this purpose, kind of creating purpose. I mean, I can always sit in the ivory tower and say, hey, organizations should be purpose driven. They should align individual purpose to organizational purpose and wonderfully pontificate. But really, I'm amazed that even HR managers attempt to even do something that has a semblance of that process, right? Because it's such a complicated process. And I don't even think they quite know how to do that. I mean, they make efforts, they make attempts. There are all kinds of, you have ways to set goals, cascade goals. You have this purpose conversations once a year, and but what Ekin is saying across time, that's such a beast to handle. And I really haven't seen. I mean, I've seen some examples of this, but I don't quite know when the rubber meets the road whether it actually happens like the way you see it when you remove yourselves from that and watch it from in hindsight, right? So I think that the time, that's really spot on, and that's really insightful.
Would it be why we connect to sustainable developmental goals, the ones that are set by the UN?
So I do feel it's useful to, at least in my thinking, I find it helpful to distinguish what direction this purpose is pointing in from the fact that everybody's pointing in one common direction. Right? So the sustainable development goals or higher purposes of that sort, which have kind of an ethical valence to it, are very appealing because, at least in the kind of cultures all of us are socialized in, we find these kind of goals to have an ethical appeal, right? But I think analytically, even if they did not have such an ethical appeal, the very fact that they orient everybody in the same direction serves a very important coordinative function. So, to make it much more prosaic, I think resilience is just as interesting if the founder's only purpose is keeping the company alive. Okay? That's not a very inspiring or romantic vision, but if everybody shares it, they do solve the problem that Ekin brought up, which is when a shock happens, we can't trust the CEOs to come up with the next bright idea. We need experimentation, but it can't be completely decentralized. There's got to be some collective direction of that experimentation, and purpose can provide it, right? So, in that sense, purpose has kind of the the prosaic element, which is just pointing everybody in the same direction, and the more higher order effect of pointing people in a morally uplifting direction. And I think separating these might make our lives a bit easier.
So, how should we look at resilience, and how should we help organizations look at this complexity issue and discuss resilience or build resilience around it or through it?
Maybe I'll start for this one because I really love complex systems. But one thing that I was really thinking, and this has been a thought that I had for a while now, is being part of a larger system. We cannot really be more complex. So I have the feeling that to understand a system, we need extra complexity to be able to pull it apart and understand the relations and understand where it's going. You got to be more complex than the system that you're studying. And especially while we're running organizations or doing research or anything, that we have to at some point acknowledge that our complexity is limited. I will never know what's happening, at the other side of the world that might affect my behaviors here. And this is in literature, we all know it as bounded rationality. And I think one very important thing is that people need to acknowledge their boundedness. And I think that already is a very important step. Complex thinking is important. Acknowledging that there is complex relationships that we cannot understand is important. And where we stand in all of that complexity and being transparent about that is, I think, important. Because in the literature, one thing that will come up often is you need to delegate. You need to decentralize, empower employees. And I feel like one of the reasons is because once you do that, now you're saying, I know that I don't know everything. So let me, rely on others and let's move forward together, because then, to put it in maybe engineering terms, we're increasing the surface area once we do that. And I think that's really important for resilience. And related to this, it doesn't only have to be internal as well. It's there's a very important part of it as in complex systems. We're not only complex inside, we're in part of a complex system, meaning that we also need external assistance, and we cannot run away from that. It's so one of my conversations with a practitioner a while ago, one of the things that frustrated him the most was organizations thinking that they can be resilient with whatever they're doing. They have the power to be resilient. But he was saying, no, you need experts. You're doing some things and you're not that deep in that topic, but some experts are. So I think reaching out to experts as well as increasing surface area, I think these are important points to that come up from this complexity view.
I want to add an observation, which is that it's true that to truly understand whatever that means, a complex system, we probably need a more complex system, right? But a less complex system can understand a more complex system by useful approximations, and that means really forcing some simplicity on the system. In fact, that's what we all do. So even all our guests, when they said we should not simplify complexity, I think what they really mean is we should not simplify it in any other way except mine. So each of them have a preferred way of simplifying the complexity. And that's what we all do, right? As theorists, that's exactly what you do. So I think that's not a fruitless path. We might want to continue to work with simplifications, but then do it with the humility that Ekin is pointing out. That these are useful approximations. This is not reality, right? And we need to bring in a diversity of perspectives to tackle a very hard problem. We probably can't do it all on our own. I'm fully on board with that. But I don't want to also leave the discussion at the point where we say things are complex, we are never going to understand them fully, and therefore it's hopeless. That's a counsel of despair I'm not ready for yet.
Thanks, Phanish. Jay, anything at the individual level that we can say about complexity and maybe our grasp of complexity?
I think, the idea of humility is important there, right? So I think, humility and psychological flexibility, cognitive flexibility. So I think the recognition that there is complexity and I may not have all the answers. And we know this from research on leadership and the role of humility in CEOs and things like that. So, Yeah, I mean, anyone who has been arrogant and who thinks they have all the answers, I think this pandemic has put them in their place, right? So everyone worth their salt is kind of reevaluating their view of the world and their life. So I think that in that sense, it's really wake up call to build some humility. So humility, psychological flexibility, cognitive flexibility, those are the sorts of individual level traits that I think would allow people to recognize complexity and then kind of respond to it. I mean, not you cannot respond to complexity without simplifying it in some sense. Otherwise, you will have some sort of a freeze response, right? So you have to engage with the complexity, run experiments, like Phanish said, and then learn from those. I think that's and the learning to learn bit is such an important part of that process as well. So that's what I would kind of respond to that to the individual level.
The Building Resilience podcast will continue broadcasting useful conversations. So here's what's scheduled next. We have The Ready, which is a consultancy helping organizations transform and bounce forward from adversities. Amy Edmondson on psychological safety and how this contributes to individual and organizational resilience. Kathleen Sutcliffe on organizational resilience. And Deborah Ancona on team resilience. We are looking to find speakers on the below resilience-related topics: collective exploration, meta-learning, learning to unlearn, Hormesis, public and private sector collaboration, resilience at a cellular level, and changing the high school curricula to support creativity, curiosity, and learning about complexity thinking. If you have speakers or guest suggestions, please let us know in the comment section below. Do not forget to like and subscribe.